Okay, my name is Philip Lee, and I'm going to be making a presentation today on my new book, Causes of the Civil War. The presentation is going to include a PowerPoint, and so I'll get started on that. I just wanted to mention, however, that you can buy this book at Amazon. My last name is spelled L-E-I-G-H. Just go to Amazon, search for Causes of the Civil War, last name Lee. You can also buy signed copies from me, and I'm going to give you a slide at the end to contact me about that. It's basically my email address, Phil_Lee, L-E-I-G-H, @me.com. Let me know of your interest, and then we'll get in touch with the email and work out the arrangements. Amazon prices these at $22. My signed copies will be $25, but they will include free shipping. So we'll just go ahead and get started. I think I need to do right now, what I need to do is to share the screen to pull up my PowerPoint. There we go. I'll just give me a second to increase the size of this so that you can see it a little better. View. Okay. This is the 12th of October, which is a Monday. Tomorrow is Tuesday, the 13th, and I'll be making this presentation down at the Sarasota, Florida Civil War Roundtable. So let's begin. Nearly all current historians claim that the Southerners caused Civil War by illegally seceding from the United States in order to perpetuate Black slavery. The original 7-state Confederacy started the fighting when it bombarded Fort Sumter. Northerners virtuously responded by suppressing the Confederate rebellion, which included 4 additional states after Sumter, thereby ending slavery and intending to establish a postbellum union, providing racial equity for ex-slaves. Almost all of the above synopsis is erroneous or deceptive. First, secession did not cause the war. Northerners could have evacuated Fort Sumter and let the 7 cotton states depart in peace, but the reason they didn't are seldom investigated. Upon examination, however, it is revealed that Northerners went to war chiefly to avoid the economic consequences of disunion. Among such consequences would have been the effects of a low tariff Confederacy adjacent to the Federal Union. The overpriced goods of tariff-protected Northern manufacturers would have lost their Southern markets to more efficient European producers. Federal tax revenues, predominantly reliant upon customs duties, would have declined by the proportion that Southerners paid. Northerners would have lost their legal monopoly on Southern coastal shipping, as the seceded states allowed competitors to enter the market. Finally, the Federal Union would have lost 60% of its exports, thereby becoming a perpetual debtor nation to its trading partners. About a month before the opening shots at Fort Sumter, a leading Boston newspaper concluded that the 7 cotton states did not secede to protect slavery, but instead to form a new country that would become an economic rival to the North. Specifically, the Boston Transcript editorialized on March 18th 1861, alleged grievances, and I'm quoting them now, alleged grievances in regard to slavery were originally the causes for separation of the cotton states, but the mask has been thrown off, and it is apparent that the people of the seceding states are now for commercial independence. The merchants of New Orleans, Charleston, and Savannah are possessed with the idea that New York, Boston, and Philadelphia may be shorn of their mercantile greatness by a revenue system verging upon free trade. If the Southern Confederation is allowed to carry out a policy by which only a nominal duty is laid upon imports, no doubt the businesses of the chief northern cities will be seriously injured. The difference is so great between the tariff of the Union and that of the Confederacy that the entire Northwest, which is the present-day Midwest, must find it to their advantage to purchase imported goods at New Orleans rather than New York. In addition, northern manufacturers will suffer from the increased importations resulting from low duties, close quote. While the transcript's analysis cannot be taken as the last word, it underscores the importance of evaluating northern motivations for coercion instead of merely focusing on southern motivations for secession. A second error of the synopsis is that the alleged illegality of secession is only presumed in retrospect. In 1860, there was no consensus on its legal status. In fact, the Northeastern states threatened secession at least 5 times between the founding of the Republic in 1789 and 1850, 61 years. The first time was during George Washington's presidency, when Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton warned that the Northeastern states would secede unless the federal government agreed to assume an obligation to pay off their Revolutionary War debts. In 1803, New Englanders threatened to secede over the Louisiana Purchase. They worried that the new territories would ultimately become new states, thereby reducing New England's influence in the federal union. Connecticut Senator James Hillhouse warned, quote, "The eastern states must and will dissolve the union and form a separate government," close quote, if they did not get their way. Other notable New Englanders, such as John Quincy Adams, Elbridge Gerry, Fisher Ames, Josiah Quincy III, Thomas Pickering, and Joseph Story, endorsed his position. In 1807, New England again threatened secession after America announced a trade embargo, hoping to avoid the War of 1812 with economic sanctions. New Englanders objected because their region was then America's maritime center. After the embargo failed, Congress declared war on Great Britain during President James Madison's first administration. But most New Englanders cooperated little in our nation's defense. They traded liberally with the enemy and refused to put their militia into federal service as ordered by President Madison. When the British finally blockaded New England during the last 7 months of the 30-month war, the region held a convention in Hartford to discuss secession and other steps to protect their interests from federal powers. In January 1815, the convention sent emissaries to President Madison to demand 5 additional constitutional amendments. Upon arriving in Washington, however, they learned that the war had ended and they went home in embarrassment. Soon thereafter, their Federalist political party collapsed. Northeastern leaders again threatened secession over the proposed annexation of Texas. In 1843, 12 congressmen, including former President John Quincy Adams, signed a letter to the public claiming that Texas annexation would not only result in the secession of free states, but would fully justify it. A year later, former New York governor and future Secretary of State under Presidents Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, William H. Seward, wrote that, quote, free labor states cannot yield, close quote, to Texas annexation. They would consider it grounds for, quote, for secession, nullification, and disunion, close quote. The Massachusetts legislature underscored the opinion by declaring in 1845 that Texas annexation would be unconstitutional. In fact, when it was annexed in 1845, they declared that act unconstitutional. In truth, secession was a remedy that geographically isolated political minorities repeatedly considered from 1789 to 1861. As a result, it tended to find favor within those regions that were out of power in Washington. It was popular in New England when Virginians were president, which included all but 4 years from 1789 to 1825. Conversely, it was popular in the South when Northerners controlled Washington, or merely the House of Representatives, where the South never had a majority due to the North's greater population. The House was uniquely important because it had the sole power to originate revenue bills. A third deception of the synopsis is that the 4 states that joined the Confederacy after President Lincoln called for troops to coerce the 7 cotton states back into the Union also seceded to protect slavery. The 4 states in the Upper South are in bright red: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. They seceded because they had earlier warned Washington that they considered coercion of any state to be unconstitutional, and they would fight against it. After joining the cotton states, they provided half of the white population from which the 11-state Confederacy drew nearly all of her soldiers. The fourth error or misrepresentation of the synopsis is that the Southern Confederacy was a rebellion. It was not. It had no purpose to replace the federal government in Washington. Everyone knew Southerners would make no attempt to overthrow Lincoln or militarily invade the northern states if the cotton states had been allowed to depart peacefully. A fifth pretext in the synopsis is the assumption that Southern secession was an unacceptable alternative to civil war because slavery would otherwise have never ended. Author James Oakes, who is in the mainstream of concurrent historians and therefore very much hostile to any Southern interpretation. Nonetheless, author James Oakes correctly observes in his book, Scorpion's Sting, that slavery would eventually end if it could not spread geographically. Southerners were well aware of Oakes's argument, as evidenced by the remarks of a former Mississippi governor to a visiting British journalist 4 years before the war. Quote, to restrict slavery within certain limits looked to be a more harmless proposition than to abolish it outright. But in reality, it was just as fatal. Room for the expansion of the institution is an absolute necessity for the South, close quote. Historian Oakes, however, erroneously assumes that only the Republican Party's blanket ban on slavery in the territories ensured that the institution, meaning slavery, would be isolated in the South. In reality, a principle involving local option voting termed popular sovereignty, convincingly demonstrated 2 years earlier that it would block the expansion of slavery when Kansas residents voted down a slave state constitution by a margin of 11,000 to 2,000 in 1858. If Southerners could not make a slave state out of Kansas by popular sovereignty, they would have been unable to do so with any of the federal territories remaining in 1860. Nearly everyone realized that. West of Texas were the arid lands of present-day New Mexico and Arizona, where agriculture could not prosper without irrigation, and the territories north and west of Kansas were even less hospitable to a slave-based agricultural economy. Nevertheless, in 1860, Southerners showed that they would honor the decisions of popular sovereignty because their presidential candidate, John C. Breckinridge, included it as a plank in his campaign platform. To be sure, the Southern version applied to votes that occurred when the pertinent territories applied for statehood. Prior to that, while they were territories, Southerners claimed a right to take slaves into any of the federal territories because such territories were legally common to the entire country. They could not be reserved for just one geographic section of immigrants. They were common to the entire country. And without the freedom to take those slaves into those territories, there was no chance that they would ever be enslaved via any method because there would simply be no slaves there. So without the freedom to immigrate into those territories, all future states would be admitted as free states by default. While Southerners could hope that America might acquire new slaveholding lands in the Caribbean or Central America, such expansion could not be accomplished without a 2/3 treaty vote in the Senate, where Southerners became a steadily smaller minority after 1850. If the Republicans had adopted popular sovereignty, they could have kept slavery quarantined in the South peacefully. But they rejected it because backing away from a total ban would have been politically fatal. Republicans were prepared to endanger the entire Union by deferring to the party's self-preservation instinct, which was ultimately chained to a meaningless point of honor, and that being they insisted on a total ban of slaves in the territories. Popular sovereignty showed that the whole country would cooperate with that if you permitted that to happen, and no new slave states could come in under popular sovereignty, at least in the territories that the United States had in 1860. And that is why President-elect Lincoln explicitly rejected popular sovereignty in a letter to an Albany Republican leader and refused all compromise. He did that because he wanted to preserve the Republican Party. One example of such a compromise was that it was a proposal that would have allowed slavery in the present-day states of New Mexico and Arizona. Not much chance of it succeeding there. But that was a compromise. He rejected it. After the Senate rejected the bill, with all Republicans voting nay, its sponsor, Kentucky Senator John Crittenden, proposed that it be submitted to the entire country as a national referendum for all voters in all states, realizing that the voters would likely approve it. Overwhelmingly, according to newspaperman Horace Greeley, the Republican-controlled Senate never took action on the referendum. Historian Kenneth Stamp concluded, Republicans looked upon compromise as the shortest route to the political suicide of their party. It would have necessarily required a repudiation of their blanket slavery ban platform. Thus, it is all too evident that reunion of the two sections through compromise was impossible without the death of the Republican Party. And there were few of its members who chose to make that sacrifice. To Republicans then, according to Stamp, belonged the responsibility that no compromise was ever offered to the South. A sixth dubious presumption of the synopsis is that Southern secession was a bad alternative to preserving the Union militarily. Rejecting secession resulted in America's bloodiest war, notwithstanding that the country's 1860 population was only 1/4 that of 1940. About 700,000 American soldiers died in the Civil Wars compared to 400,000 in World War II. Since America's white 1860 population, from which she mainly obtained her soldiers, was only 2.7 million, the 700,000 Civil War soldier deaths translate to a loss ratio of 2.6%, which would equate to over 8.5 million deaths if applied to America's current population. Furthermore, as a wartime president, Lincoln ran roughshod over civil liberties. He arrested Maryland legislatures in order to prevent the state's secession, disabled Missouri's legislature, disbanded Missouri's legislature under the glitter of federal bayonets, suspended habeas corpus in defiance of a contrary ruling by the Chief Justice, shut down opposition newspapers, imprisoned thousands of citizens on political whim, and manipulated the 1864 soldier vote. The Civil War may not have been worth the cost of the violence done to the Constitution and its irrevocable push toward a progressively more centralized government. Seventh, historians who point to the declaration of causes for secession provided by some of the 7 cotton states as proof, quote, proof of the primacy of slavery, often overlook other disputes between Northerners and Southerners that are revealed by comparing their respective constitutions. Unlike the federal Constitution, the Confederacies did not allow protective tariffs. Southerners were ahead of their time in recognizing the benefits of free trade. They also outlawed public works spending, which instead had to be financed by private industry or the states themselves. Since Southerners were repelled by crony capitalism, their Constitution prohibited subsidies for private industry that had been allowed under the General Welfare Clause of the federal Constitution. The Confederate Constitution only permitted spending for military defense, repayment of national debt, and the operating cost of the central government. Just those 3 things. No pork barrel spending. It also included a number of features that underscored the states' rights philosophy. Constitutional amendments, for example, could only be initiated by a convention of as few as 3 states, not Congress. The individual states could also impeach Confederate office holders operating entirely within the borders of such states. The trial would take place in the Senate in Richmond, but they could be impeached, that is, charged by the legislatures of the state. Additionally, historians who cite the Declaration of Causes to assert the primacy of slavery as a cause of the Civil War generally fail to note that at least 10 northern free states passed legislative resolutions to explain their objections to secession, while the first 7 Gulf states were leaving the Union during December 1860 and January 1861. Those 10 states came out with these joint resolutions in just 2 months, December 1860, January 1861. 10 states of the North responding to the secession of 7 states in the South. This was before the war, before the shooting. Not one of those 10 stated any wish to abolish slavery. The most consistent complaint was opposition to a breakup of the Union, which later became condensed into the noble-sounding phrase of preserving the Union. Thus, Northerners mainly went to war in order to avoid the economic consequences of disunion, as explained earlier. The eighth error in the synopsis or misrepresentation. While Northerners were progressively opposed to the expansion of slavery for more than a decade before the Civil War, it should be understood that it was chiefly to reserve the Western lands for whites, not a noble gesture to end slavery. Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot made the first attempt to block expansion of slavery while leaving it untouched in the slave states. 12 weeks after the Mexican War started, he attached a restrictive rider to a $2 million funding bill needed to fund the Army. His rider would require that slavery be prohibited in any territories acquired as a result of the war. Although the soon named Wilmot Proviso is commonly misinterpreted as a moral weapon against slavery, it was really motivated by white supremacy. Specifically, Wilmot said, "I make no war upon the South, nor upon slavery in the South. I have no squeamish sensitivities upon the subject of slavery, nor morbid sympathy for the slave. I plead the cause of the rights of white freemen. I would preserve for free white labor." When you say preserve, he means the territories in the West. "I would preserve for free white labor a fair country, a rich inheritance where the sons of toil of my own race and my own color can live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor," close quote. Although the 1846 proviso passed the House, it failed in the Senate. Nonetheless, it remained a lingering Northern objective for years thereafter. In 1848, Democrats nominated former Michigan Governor Lewis Cass as their presidential candidate. Although Cass had opposed the proviso, he raised popular sovereignty as a democratic way to allow new states to decide by popular vote whether they wanted to join the Union as either free or slave. Although Cass lost the election, popular sovereignty survived as a principle that might end the seemingly perpetual arguments over the future of slavery. In 1854, Democrat Senator Stephen A. Douglas sponsored the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which would carve the Nebraska Territory out of a part of the Kansas Territory and authorize each of those territories to decide for themselves whether they shall be either slave states or free states by popular vote at such time as they apply for statehood. A ninth misrepresentation of the synopsis: contrary to popular belief, postbellum Republicans were not generous toward their defeated foe. The victor's peace was primarily shaped by their antebellum priorities, which tended to impoverish the South. One example was the protective tariff. It was a powerful weapon for enabling Northern manufacturers to establish domestic monopolies by blocking imports, but also encouraged European manufacturing economies to buy their raw materials from countries other than America, because the tariffs limited their ability to sell us imports, and the imports would be the way they would get the dollars they needed to pay for our exports. On the eve of the Civil War, tariffs on dutiable items averaged 19%, but increased to an average of 45% for the next 50 years. Consider the example of railroad iron. In 1861, the 11th state Confederacy had more railroad mileage than any other country in the world except the United States. Even though Southern railroads badly needed rebuilding after the war, railroad iron sold for $80 a ton in New York as compared to $32 a ton in Liverpool. The differential, which was more than 100%, was largely due to tariffs demanded by Northern iron makers. Even though Midwestern grain states might otherwise have supported free trade along with the South, the Republican Party held power by essentially bribing former Midwestern Union soldiers with generous veterans' pensions. The pensions, argued the GOP, required high tariffs in order to fund them. The Republican Party generally controlled national politics from the start of the Civil War in 1861 to the bottom of the Great Depression in 1932, over 70 years. Each of the 12 states that joined the Union during the 35 years from 1861 to 1896 added 2 new Republican senators. Let me repeat that. 12 states between 61 and 96. All 12 added 2 new Republican senators. That's 24 right there. Not until 1907, 42 years after the war had ended, did a single state, Oklahoma, enter the Union with a Democrat senator. Republicans transformed the South into an exploited internal colony, much like Great Britain had done with Ireland. Perhaps because of slavery, the region was the world's low-cost producer of cotton before the war. But it remained the world's low-cost producer long thereafter because nearly all of her people had been impoverished by the war, and they stayed that way, owing to the Republican Party's control in Washington. Most American cotton was exported well into the 20th century. In 1860, the South's per capita income was at the 72nd percentile of the national average. After the Civil War, it dropped to the 51st percentile and stayed there for at least 35 years. It did not return to the still below average 1860 percentile until 1950, 90 years later. Shortly after the war, Republicans set up puppet Southern regimes by disfranchising many ex-Confederates and transforming freedmen into a Republican loyal voting bloc. They made false promises to the freedmen and taught them to hate their former masters. When Republican Ulysses Grant was elected president in 1868, he won only a minority of American white voters and gained the edge in the popular vote only because of the ex-slave vote. Postbellum Republicans launched the Gilded Age of crony capitalism by giving away 200 million acres of land to northern railroads, that's twice the amount of property presently within California's borders. Only negligible land grants went to the former slaves. By 1877, Republicans had abandoned the blacks because the party could control Congress and the presidency without them. The so-called more perfect union that Lincoln had hoped to form became one in which blacks and white Southerners had been dumped into peonage. Even as late as the 1940s, both races worked under conditions that were little different than the Russian serfs of the 19th century. The conqueror's version of black civil rights did not include having blacks live among Northerners. In fact, the chief racial goal of Northern whites was to keep blacks out of the North. Since freedmen comprised a decisive Republican loyal Southern voting bloc until 1880, the GOP wanted to keep them there. Simultaneously, Northern workers did not want job-seeking blacks to cross the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line. Republican Congressman George Boutwell, who later became Treasury Secretary under President Grant, proposed to reserve the states of South Carolina and Florida exclusively for blacks. Contrary to the misrepresentations of social activist historians today, 19th century and Jim Crow era Northerners were often at least as racist as Southerners. When French tourist Alexis de Tocqueville visited America in 1930, he observed that race prejudice was most obvious in the states that never had slavery. In 1854, Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "The whole nation is interested that the best use shall be made of the federal territories. We want them for the homes of free white people, close quote. 4 years later, he said, quote, I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. And as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race, close quote. During the Civil War, New York lawyer George Templeton Strong wrote in his famous journal, we Northerners object to slavery on grounds of political economy, not ethics. During the Jim Crow era in 1915, when a white boxer beat the aging black heavyweight champion, a crowd of Wall Street bankers, this is a large crowd outdoors, they were watching the telegraphed results. When it was announced the white boxer won, they pounded their unknown neighbors on their back and acted like gleeful school children. One of the prime reasons I wrote Causes of the Civil War was to counter the one-sidedness that has induced mob hysteria against Confederate heritage and our statues. As noted, historian James Oakes is probably correct when concluding that slavery would have ended if quarantined in the South after 1860. But that could have been accomplished with popular sovereignty. In 1860, in all of the territories west of the Missouri River, there were a grand total of 46 slaves and 20 slaveholders. So popular sovereignty could have prevented the end of quarantine. It could have quarantined slavery in the South without any civil war. The Republicans demanded a total ban simply out of a self-preservation instinct, and the result was the Civil War. These are some of my other books. An annotated version of Company H. Trading with the Enemy is about intersectional trade during the war. Twice as much cotton was sold to the Northerners as went through the blockade. Northerners bought cotton from Southerners during the war. Lee's Lost Dispatch, there's about 11 stories in here that, and Lee's Lost Dispatch at Sharpsburg is one example. Confederacy at Flood Tide considers the period from June 1862 to December 1862, when the Confederacy came closest to winning its independence. Southern Reconstruction is my analysis of Reconstruction after the war. U.S. Grant's presidency is a good look at the 18th president, because he has been sanctified, deified, what do you call it? He was not a great president, not at all. Right here, you will see my email address, phil_lee@me.com. Email me there if you'd like to get a signed copy of this, Causes of the Civil War. If you want an unsigned copy, just go to Amazon and buy it. So that completes our presentation, and I thank you for listening, and I'm going to stop the recording.